Hello everyone, I hope you're all doing very well today and welcome back to another FMDataLab video. Today I'm going to cover some of the new and exciting features I've developed since my last video. So let's start off with the first new feature, and that is called Direct Upload. Direct Upload allows you to upload your exported Football Manager data without needing to log in or sign up. This works almost identical to how the user file upload currently works, in that the end result in the table view is exactly the same. Just that the file will not be uploaded directly to your account to view again in the future, so once you refresh the page, you'll need to upload the file again. This new direct upload feature is perfect if you only need to view the data once or twice and don't need to reference it again later. One of the key benefits of direct upload is the increase in the limit of players you can export. With the current user file upload, you are restricted to 5,000 players, but with direct upload, that limit is increased to 20,000 players. I did have to keep it restricted to 20,000 players as there is a lot of computation involved in calculating all these role scores. Even for 20,000 players, you may find that your browser may freeze. Other than that, the process is almost exactly the same. You download the FMDataLab views, import the views into Football Manager, export the players using FMDataLab views, then upload via the new upload page. The next feature I'm going to touch on is quite a big one. It's the one I spent the most time developing, and it did take me a little over a month and a half to get it to its current state. If you do happen to follow me on Twitter, or X as it's now known, you might have seen that I teased this new feature. Be sure to follow me on there to get little teasers into what I'm working on next on FMDataLab. This feature is potential trajectories of player role scores. Essentially, you can now view a player's predicted future potential trajectory role scores for each of their playable roles throughout their career. There are 4 potential trajectories that you can use to predict the player's future role scores. What are these 4 potential trajectories? Firstly, there is the upper trajectory. This trajectory will be for players that may have a very high potential ability and expect rapid growth year on year. Then we have the above average trajectory, which is for players that may have a high potential ability and expect an above average score increase year on year. Then we have the median trajectory. Most players are likely to fall into or around this trajectory, with their projected role score either just above or below the median trajectory line. This is for players that have a average potential ability and expect an average progress year on year. Finally, we have the lower trajectory. This is for players that may have a low potential ability and may potentially experience a decline year on year. So why do I have 4 potential trajectories and not just the one? I think it's key to understand that there are several factors that can influence a player's career progression. For instance, if you take 4 players that are all the same age and all have identical role scores for a particular role, you can find that each of those 4 players' peak role scores can vary significantly due to factors such as, but not limited to, a player's potential ability value, that if you have the in-game editor enabled, you'll be able to see that exact figure, the club's training or youth facilities, the club's coach's ability, a player's training and development and how much is tailored to facilitate a role, appropriate playing time relative to the player's age, the player's injury history or their proneness to injury, players being mentored, the level of competition they come up against, hidden attributes and their personality. So on screen now you can see a line chart, and this line chart illustrates the trajectories of 4 different players from the same youth intake year. All players are 15 years old and all players have the exact same role score for the central midfielder role in the attack duty. However, as you can see in the line chart, as each of their careers progress, their role scores start to diverge in different directions as they approach the peak age for their role, which is 26 years old. And that highlights the importance of considering trajectory ranges and not just a single trajectory. How are the trajectories calculated? Now, this is where it gets a little convoluted. I found it quite hard to describe exactly what the algorithm I've created to predict role trajectories actually does, as it's all sort of in my head, and putting it into words makes it sound probably more complicated than it really is, but I will try my best just to highlight that these figures are not just some random figures I've plucked out of thin air. They're all calculated from a large data set of players. The trajectory figures are all based on a data set of just over 15,000 youth players from various youth intake years, and then tracking their progress of each of the players' role scores year on year. I can effectively use an algorithm to calculate the trajectories for each role from one age to another. For each youth intake, I holiday to each subsequent year and exported data until no players within that youth intake were still actively playing, which is, for most cases, roughly 25 years. So I end up with a total of 220 exported files. For each of these exported files, I calculated role scores. Just like how FMDataLab calculates role scores, the role scoring calculation is performed for all roles that a player can play. The rationale behind calculating role scores only for the roles that a player can play is that, for instance, when we consider a dataset of strikers, the average increase in role score from one year to another for a wingback role, let's say, might end up being just around 0.4. However, when we analyse a dataset of wingbacks with the same age, the average increase from the same wingback role could be much higher, so something like 1. This demonstrates that players tend to improve at a faster rate in roles they are suited for, so including players who cannot play in a role can distort the projected trajectory and in turn reduce accuracy. So with all the role scores calculated, I was able to calculate the year-on-year role score difference for each year each player is active. So you can see on screen now an example of a file that gets created by the algorithm that is used in future parts of the algorithm as a reference. So this is an example of a single player and their role score differences from age 15 to 16, and then again from 16 to 17. And this process repeats itself for each age range up until 38 to 39. And the reason for it's 38 to 39 is I didn't have a large enough data set of players between 39 and 40, so that's why it ends at 39. With all this data, the next part of the algorithm is that it iterates over all 117 roles. Then within each role, through all age ranges, so from 15 to 16 all the way up to 38 to 39, I compile a list of differences of role scores between each age from all players, which you can see on screen now. For the same player we just looked at before, this is the role score difference between when they were 15 and 16, so you can see the list of roles with the role key being the role itself and the diff key being the total difference between the role scores from one year to the next. Using the previously generated file I showed you before, you can see where, for example, the 0.24 comes from for the Regista role, as when they're 15 they have a Regista score of 12.09, and when they're 16 for the Regista role they rise to 12.33, and 12.33 minus 12.09 is 0.24. Now that I have the total role score difference from one year to another for every role at every age, I can utilise this dataset to calculate potential trajectories. This is accomplished once again by iterating through each of the 117 roles, then within each role iterating through all age ranges. Then for each age range, I compile a list of numbers representing the difference from the selected age to the following year. These numbers are then sorted in the descending order. You see on screen now that list of sorted numbers. In this instance, there are 747 numbers. This is 747 player role score differences for the goalkeeper role between the ages of 15 and 16. For each list of numbers that is created for every role's age ranges, I can use these to get our trajectory figures. The upper trajectory is the median number of the top third of the list of numbers. So if you had a list of 612 player role score differences for a particular age, it would take the top 204 role score differences, then find the median of that list of 204 numbers. The above average trajectory is the median number of the top half of the list of numbers. The median trajectory is the median number of all of the numbers in the list of numbers. The lower trajectory is the median number of the bottom third of the list of numbers. You can see on screen now to visualize how this data then gets output and subsequently used within FMDataLab. So looking at the Regista role again, you can see that when a player is 15, the upper trajectory predicts that a player will progress by 0.86 on their current score when they turn 16. So say for example, the player has a score of 10 for the Regista role at 15 years old. The upper trajectory predicts that their score for the Regista role will increase to 10.86 when they are 16. Then they are expected to increase by another 0.76 when they turn 17. So at 17 they could have a total role score of 11.62 for the Regista role. This is essentially how the calculation for the role score trajectories are done within FMDataLab. It takes any given player's role, then looks at their age and applies each trajectory figure to their current score for that role. Then the following year applies the trajectory figure to the accumulated score for each trajectory. What are some of the caveats you should be aware of when looking at the trajectory data? So the trajectories are based on the default attribute weights. Therefore, if you have custom attribute weights, the scores will not be as accurate. Predicting which trajectory a player will fall into can be challenging, especially when assessing a player at the beginning of their career or lacking the data of their previous role scores to determine their historical trajectory. It's unlikely that a player will adhere perfectly to a single trajectory line throughout their career, but you may observe them closely following one of the trajectory line from one year to another. Furthermore, the trajectories do not consider a player's date of birth in relation to your in-game date of your exported save. So for instance, a 20-year-old who has just turned 20 may progress differently from a 20-year-old who turns 21 the following day. The trajectories only utilise the player's current age and does not account for this variation. So I've mentioned peak age before, so how are these peak ages calculated within each role? For each role, the algorithm assesses when the role score for the median trajectory would reach its highest point, which you can see how this looks on screen now. You can see all the roles and their peak age. For all goalkeeper roles, it happens that the peak age is 28 years old across the board, and for the majority of outfield roles, the peak age is 26 years old. This implies that for most outfield players, the last significant progression in a role occurs at age 25, and in many instances, players maintain a stable role score for 2 or 3 years before experiencing a decline. Another feature alongside the trajectories is competition benchmarks. Competition benchmarks are the average role score for all starters in teams from various competitions. This is to aid in your understanding of a player's current level and their potential future level. Within the role score trajectories chart, which you will see momentarily, the chart displays several reference lines representing competition benchmarks. For each competition, role scores are calculated for all starters across their playable roles. Then for a selected role, the average role score for starters in that competition is determined. The competitions are based on the English League Pyramid and the 3 European competitions last 16 teams. This goes from the English regional leagues up to and including the Championship, then also includes the bottom and then the top half of the Premier League, and then also the top 4 of the Premier League. Then also has the average score from all starting players in the last 16 in the Conference League, the Europa League and the Champions League. So enough of chatting through this, let's see this in action. So when viewing any of your files and navigating to the table view, by default the player trajectories are not displayed to reduce clutter in the table view. A new button will appear above the table. It'll initially be labelled as Show Trajectories. Clicking this button will reveal all upper trajectory scores on roles alongside the base role score for the players capable of playing that role and who have not reached the peak age for that role. Hovering over a trajectory role score will display the other potential peak role scores from the other trajectories. If the player cannot play in the position assigned to the role, or if the player is at the role peak age or older, then you'll see this info icon that has a tooltip providing you with exactly why you cannot see a trajectory figure for that player on that role. If you have custom weights for a particular role, you will see this little warning icon that will appear to indicate that trajectory scores may not be as accurate, as aforementioned the trajectory data is based on the default attribute weights. Sorting and filtering on a role when trajectories are shown will use the upper trajectory score as the value to sort or filter on if available, otherwise it will just use the player's current score. That will be for players that cannot play that role or have reached the peak age or older. You can see a more detailed view of all the trajectory data in the player panel. So by clicking on a player's name, this will open up the players panel, which includes the trajectories chart and competition benchmarks. Within the player panel, above the chart, there's a role selection drop-down menu, where you can select all roles that a player can play. Choosing a role from the drop-down will display the player's trajectory for the selected role. By default, the role that's selected is the role with the highest current role score. On the line chart, the x-axis represents ages, starting at the player's current age and ending at 49. The y-axis indicates a player's role score for the selected role. The line chart consists of 4 lines, each representing one of the 4 trajectories. You can hover over any x-axis ticks to get the values of each trajectory at the selected age, as well as which competition benchmark that each trajectory role is the closest to. Additionally, a vertical reference line appears on the x-axis, marking the role's peak age. There are also horizontal reference lines that indicate the average role score for starters across the various competitions for the selected role, as mentioned earlier with the competition benchmarks. Below the chart you can also view the specific benchmark scores. The question you might raise at this point is, do players really follow these projected trajectories throughout their career? The answer is yes, but there's a but. Most players do end up close to either side of a trajectory line, and while most will follow closely to a single trajectory for most of their career, they may have the odd blip where they trend towards another trajectory over a few years during their career. On screen you can see a few examples of players that do follow each trajectory line the closest. So let's follow a player's career year on year using FMDataLab with the trajectory data. So here's Miguel Campos, a 16-year-old from the 2024 Youth Intake who plays for Tondela, who play in the second tier of Portugal. Using FMDataLab, in an exported file which includes all Youth Intake players in 2024, he is the 100th highest ranked regista, with a role score of 11.25, which is about the level of an average starter in League 2. So you could use this, say, if you had this player in your squad and wanted to loan him out to a club to get some playing time. League 2 might be the level you'd most likely want him to compete in. You'll try and find some League 2 level clubs to loan him out to. You can see here that his upper trajectory at the peak age for a regista, which is 25 years old, is projected to be 15.01, which would get him into most top 4 Premier League teams. For some reference, at the very start of the game, the best regista as calculated by FMDataLab is Jude Bellingham, who has a regista score of 16.35. A regista with a 15.01 role score would be someone like Pascal Gross, who is the 22nd highest ranked regista at the start of the game. If we look at Miguel Campos' trajectory chart, we can see that next year when he turns 17, his upper trajectory could be 12.01, which is closer to an average starter in League 1. So let's have a look at the following year and see how he's progressed. His regista role score has increased to 12.03, which is slightly above the projected upper trajectory of 12.01. And from players from the 2024 Youth Intake, he is now the 71st highest ranked regista, so he's jumped 29 places in rank from the previous year. His upper trajectory peak now for the regista is projected to be 15.03, which is up from 15.01 the previous year. If we look at his trajectory chart again, we can see that next year when he turns 18, that his upper trajectory could be 12.65, which is closer to an average starter in the championship. So let's have a look at the following year and see how he's progressed. His regista role score has increased to 12.83, which again is above the projected 12.65 from the year before. And from players from the 2024 Youth Intake, he is now the 47th highest ranked regista, so he's jumped another 22 places in rank, showing that he's progressing at a higher rate than most of the other 2024 Youth Intake players that were ahead of him in rank at the start of his career. His upper trajectory peak role score for the regista is now went up to 15.21, up from 15.03 the previous year, which is above the average starter for a Premier League top 4 team. So now let's jump to when he's 25 years old, at the peak age for the regista role, and see how he's progressed. His role score has increased now to 15.7, which is again above the projected 15.21 he had when he was 18. And from the players from the 2024 Youth Intake, he is now the 3rd highest ranked regista. So he went from when he was 16 to being the 100th ranked regista. He's jumped 97 places in those 9 years. Again, for some reference, at the very start of the game, the closest player he resembles now in regards to his regista role score is Mateo Kovacic, and he's not that far behind players like Sergio Busquets and Ilkay Gundogan, which shows he could definitely play for a top team, but does happen to find himself at a Saudi club, so get your money, son. But does later go on to play for Manchester United and has a whole host of international caps, and his average rating is actually really good. In regards to his overall regista rank from all the players in the save at the point of his peak, he's actually ranked 10th overall, which is definitely not too shabby considering where he started as being the 100th ranked in just a Youth Intake. So all of this highlights that there may be some gems further down the ranks that you may be unaware of until you show the trajectories. If you look at a player's progress year on year and assess where they may be potentially at their peak, then you can evaluate with someone like Miguel Campos, who continually follows the upper trajectory, and then assess where they may potentially be at their peak, and then whether it's worth purchasing them when they're younger at a lower price. As I mentioned before, it's quite hard to tell at the start of their career where he would go, because he obviously go in sort of 4 different directions. But you can sort of see that when he jumped to 17, he followed the upper trajectory, and then again at 18, he followed the upper trajectory, so it's pretty safe to assume that that's probably the trend he's going to follow. So at that point you can go, well, as it was predicted before, he was initially for the regista role, he's predicted to be 15.01. Obviously he got above that and he's 15.7, but you sort of seen he went slightly above the upper trajectory for a number of years, and so you could probably assume that he will end up being slightly above it. Not only is it useful for signing youth players and Wonderkids and what have you, it's also useful for your own club's youth intake to assess who to potentially sign on a full-time contract or who to let go when the time comes. Apologies for how long-winded this feature was, but I hope it all makes sense and you can see where you can use trajectory data to find some hidden gems. So have fun playing about with it. But we're not done yet with all the new features, so let's continue to the next feature, which is exporting table data to a CSV file. Now within the table view, you can export table data to a CSV file. Above the table is now an Export CSV button. Clicking this button will download a CSV file and it will contain all of the current table columns and rows. So if you filter, sort or hide columns, this will be represented in the CSV file. I should note at this point anyway, the trajectories are not included in the CSV file, but maybe will be in a future date. The next new feature on FMDataLab is the ability to persist column visibility between table views. So now when you toggle a column's visibility in a file table view, the columns visibility options will persist across all table views, so now you will not need to keep re-hiding columns that you want to hide every time you view a file. The one caveat to this is that I have made sure that the role columns visibility is always visible when you initially load a file. So even if you were to toggle it off in one file and come back to another file, it will then be visible again. This is to not inadvertently have important data hidden. If you had forgotten you had hidden that role and then removed that role from the role selection screen and then re-added it again in the future and you're wondering why it's been hidden. So that's just to handle that kind of permutation. So if you toggled a few columns off and you want to bring them all back again, you can toggle all columns to be visible with the View All button. So worth noting, just like the attribute weights, that these hidden columns are stored in your browser. So if you were to view an FMDataLab in another browser or another device, your settings won't be persisted. The final feature is the Attribute Analysis Radar Chart. You can find the Attribute Analysis Radar Chart on any player panel at the bottom of the Attributes section. This mimics the exact values that are used in the Attribute Analysis Radar Charts within Football Manager. These are the ones you can see on screen now. So that's it for all these changelog updates. I hope you all enjoy the new updates, and bye for now.